Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hello and welcome to another video on something a little different this time. I'm going to talk about a topic that I'm particularly passionate about, and that is finishing your frickin' ROM hack. And so the reason I wanted to make this video is I know that finishing a hack ROM project, or really any sort of creative endeavor, it's a marathon, dude. It's an absolute marathon, and I in no way want to say that it is easy, it is simple, because it's not. It's challenging. But I've done it, and I think you can too. And while there's a lot of traits and attributes you need to have, intrinsically, I think, to really get the job done, there's a lot of tips that you can take away that'll help you better organize yourself and prepare yourself to finish your ROM hack. Much like how Intelligence Systems finished their seminal ROM hack, the Sacred Stones. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of these things. Let's start with learning objectives. So what are we going to actually learn today? Identify tips and habits that'll help you finish your project. This is so crucial. I think, especially when you're a solo developer, there are so many different things that you can be doing at any given time for your ROM hack project. And it's important to understand how to best organize those things, especially when you're new and you're not getting a ton of guidance. I mean, right, you're doing this as a hobby, it's fun, but you also want to be productive and move in the right direction. And without that type of guidance or community, it can be a little bit more challenging. And while there are resources and people who will help you, ultimately you're the driving force behind your creative efforts. And so having these types of habits will help you be more productive. By the end of this video, you'll also be able to create a project plan and organize yourself for success. I love project plans. I think that they're really good for keeping things on task. I'm not saying you need to have anything super formal with dates or anything like that, but at the very least knowing what are the steps I need to take so that I don't miss anything, but also am moving in the right direction. You can know what are my breakpoints, when should I go back and ask for feedback, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. And then lastly, streamline the development process. Like I said before, there are so many different directions you can move, so many different ways you can continue to develop your project, and streamlining that is going to be really key if you want to finish it in this lifetime. So, first things first, you have an idea, let's map it out. And so, for me, we're going to assume here that you're coming in as someone who's like, you know what? I want to make my own hack ROM, and I have an idea. All right, well, idea guy, let's map that out for you. And so, when it comes to mapping out your idea, there's a couple of different things you need to consider, and typically in this order. First is understanding, well, what do you want to make? Depending on what you want to make, it's going to determine the 3 bullets below. For example, if you're trying to make yet another Fire Emblem 6 rebalance for whatever reason, guys, please stop making Fire Emblem 6 rebalances. We don't need them. You can probably just do that in FE Builder. And it's an easier development process because you're just tweaking some numbers and adding in your self-insert. That's easy. Now, if you want to do something completely custom with these different mechanics, you want to use Berwick-style mercenaries and Lazerbian turn flow and all this custom stuff and ASM, maybe a build file. Have you considered using a build file? Said Pikmin1211. Right? So consider that. Know what you want to make. Scope out the idea. See if it works and see if it gets you excited. I know for myself, when I was in this phase, I would actually write up short outlines to kind of help me build the world. So writing a story, all right, from the perspective of this country, what's happened recently, and writing a short narrative, if it was a 12 chapter or so, arbitrary number outline of story events, does that get me excited? No, but there's some good stuff here. Maybe I can incorporate that elsewhere. Let me try this again from a different perspective. And I kind of just went through this exercise, and not only did it help me build out the world, but it also helped me figure out what was I most excited about and what did I really want to invest time building. Because you have to be really excited about your idea and maintain that excitement, and have a story you want to tell or a gameplay concept you really want to execute. Because if you don't, then why are you even making a hack ROM? It's supposed to be fun. You're supposed to be passionate and excited about it. It shouldn't feel like work, at least not too often. So once you've had this general idea of what you want to make. I'm assuming here most of you are probably interested in making your own feature-length custom project, like a HackerOn project of at least like 20 chapters or so. Figure out then your development method. You know, the two most popular in the community right now are using FE Builder and build files. I think that if you have the time and technical expertise to learn build files, I think it's probably going to be better for your project long term. However, I can't stress enough just how much simpler FE Builder can be at times, and it has a shorter ramp. And for me, as someone who's not very technical and more of a visual person when it comes to seeing like how things are working, I found FE Builder very helpful. Again, it's really a matter of preference. You're basically the way you should think about it is, if I'm using FE Builder, I want more convenience and easier visuals. And if I'm going build files, is I want greater technical customization and flexibility, and also make it easier for other people to contribute to the project should they want to. You can also do some hybridization of the three, or of the two, by, let's say, for example, you start the project as a build file, you build it once it's all set up, and then you continue making edits in FE Builder. That's also a viable method of development. It really depends on what you think will work for you and who you want to be involved. Generally speaking, I think if you're creating a build file, it's going to be easier to get outside help, but it might take a little bit longer for you to get set up and start moving and making progress. So just some things to consider for a first-time hacker. Definitely do some research on the development methods and see which one speaks to you and what will be more fun for you to work with, as well as help you better reach your goals. Once you've aligned on this and you have you have your ROM open, you've created your build file, you've made a clean ROM to insert for FE Builder, you want to think about your mechanics and gameplay. And the mechanics and gameplay, this is, you know, do I want to balance my game around capture? Do I want skills? What do skills even look like if I choose to have them? How, you know, what kind of enemy stats do I want? What are the classes that I want to have? Generally aligning on what these gameplay ideas will be is going to be important, because you want to make sure that you're able to set up everything ahead of time. You basically want to create a platform for which you can then manipulate and edit chapters. And by doing so, it'll just make development downstream a lot easier. So you might not necessarily make a ton of progress up front story-wise, but you will know, all right, I've built out my system, I have all my items set up, I have all my classes set up. Now I can just test and tweak, because I'm able to just build with exactly what I want versus having to do it and go along and adjust as I go. So something to consider. And then lastly, story. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but what do you want? What story do you want to tell? And having an outline for this ahead of time really helps. I like writing chapter by chapter outline with just a high level of like, this is the battle, here's the story beats, this is who joins at that point roughly, and this is the general objective. And just kind of like leaving it like that and having some visuals in my head for what I want, and then just like slowly writing it out. But having that outline kind of helps you stay grounded and make sure that you kind of know beginning to end what this is going to look like. I think it's a common mistake for people to just kind of like wing it as they go. And I think that can lead to inconsistencies, people complaining about plot holes, and all that fun stuff. So just something to keep in mind. Write with the end in mind. That's something that Blueby would say, and I agree. Write with the end in mind. So how do you stay organized throughout all of this? Well, if you're working in a build file, spreadsheets are going to be your friend. Spreadsheets are your friend in general. I think spreadsheets are great for laying out your ideas. What do I want my items to look like? What do I want my classes to look like? What do I want my characters to look like? It's an easy way to share and get feedback with others as well. It's a great mechanism for doing so. You want to keep notes for easy access. I personally kept a lot of notes in my email and would just save them in a draft and would just go and like, if I'm, you know, on a walk and thought of something, I would just like jot it down in my email real quick. Some people like to use services like Evernote or a notepad. This is also perfectly fine. You just want to have some type of place where you write these notes as they come about so that you can then later include them in a spreadsheet or insert them into the ROM, or just something to keep in mind for later that might be a good idea. And then lastly, Discord. It's the way we communicate right now in the community. It's the tool of the week, to say the least. I think there used to be Skype groups or MSN groups and all that kind of stuff, and now everything's on Discord. And Discord it's pretty good for project management with the different channels, and you can pin stuff and you can link to things and file share. It's a pretty good project management tool, both for the solo developer and the team developer. So having these things to stay organized will be really important. I would say these are going to be your big 3 for keeping yourself in check and not losing anything. It really stinks to lose stuff. Additionally, and not listed here, make sure you have a nice, neat folder for any of your files related to the hack, so it's easy to find, like spare copies of ROMs or your mugs. And like your build file, you'll naturally insert this in a certain way, but if you're doing it in Builder, it can be a little less intuitive in this regard for file storage and saving. So just make sure you keep backups in places where they're easy for you to find and identify. So what is your development process actually going to look like? And this is where I think there's the biggest opportunity for improvement. And so this is my development process, and my goal with this development process is to work in an agile way. And so my software development friends out there, you're probably familiar with this. This should look pretty straightforward to you. For those of you who are unfamiliar, agile is a method of development typically used in software engineering where you are working in manageable chunks to create something called a minimum viable product, or MVP. And this is, in product management terms, what is the bare minimum you need to go to market to start getting feedback. And so the idea is that you're going to market, aka the player base, with something that is playable, that's not perfect, with the intent of getting feedback and quickly iterating on it to make those improvements. This idea stems from older software development methods called waterfall, where a team would work on something end to end without getting feedback in the interim. And there would be situations where, let's say I'm a software company and I'm building the software, and by the time I actually got through all of it and shipped the product to market, the needs had shifted and I shipped something and wasted my time. This allows you to make sure that your time between identifying a need and pushing something to market is as small as possible. Because you might say, wow, there's a trend right now in the community that I think is really hot and I want to get in on that, right? Maybe this is the idea that I have and I think people will like it. And if you wait 5 years, that's going to change, right? If you wait 5 years to develop something and push it out, people are going to say this feels dated, and that's not good. Maybe it's still fun, but like the reception might not be as positive as you want. I mean, you should always be developing for yourself in this case, and that's one of the key differences between being a professional in software development versus just making a ROM hack. But if you're like me and want to make something that you both enjoy, as well as the community, then having this process is really helpful. And especially if you're new and not sure how good things are, getting the feedback early and often is really key. So when it comes to the actual process of doing this, it's a cycle. And the first step before even getting into the cycle are setting up your mechanics, custom hacks, items, and classes. These are really the backbone of your hack. And like I alluded to before, this is really the platform with which you can then develop with. You want to set up all of the modular components so that it's easier for you to then go and say, all right, I make a chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. My goal in my development process is to set up as much as possible in the different tables so that when I want to go actually make the chapter, I'm just moving around different pieces and testing as I need to, versus, okay, I want to add an axe cavalier. Let me go make the axe cav and set up the class and then get back into chapter building. It's a different workflow. And I'd much rather go through and organize my entire class list and map that out, and then work with the individual classes and only make minor tweaks as I need. Okay, maybe the base defense needs to be lowered a little bit. Maybe the HP needs to be a little bit higher. Maybe I should add more might to an iron sword, right? Like, these are things that are easier to tweak, but it's much better than like, oh, I wanted to put the funny Kellic sword, the Flamberge, into my ROM hack. It's chapter 10. Let me stop what I'm doing in the middle of chapter creation, go back, add the sword, and then go back into chapter creation. It's just a little bit more disjointed. And so setting everything up, at least as much as you think you know up front, is going to be really helpful in making that development process smoother. And so when you're getting into the stage then, that phase 2 of, I want to start building chapters so that I can play and that others can play, this is generally how I execute. To build a chapter, first start with the idea. The idea should already be mapped out in your story outline document. Then I usually create the actual map. I like using FE Map Maker and then inserting into FE Builder to create tile changes. Some people like to use tiled and just create the tile changes directly in that. That's probably a bit easier if you're using a build file. So different methods to consider, but either way, you want to make a map. You then want to insert that map and do your enemy placement. Where do you think the enemies should go? What levels should they be? What items do they drop? Etc. Where is the player going to be placed? Once you have the general idea of where the enemies are going to be, adding in the events, and this is inclusive of, changing the tiles for when a snag breaks or a wall breaks, seize thrones, setting up your shops, just making sure that the map interacts with the player as it's intended. And at this point, the map should be perfectly playable. And I would generally do a quick pause to test here to just see how the map plays. Unless you're like me and wrote everything up ahead of time, have your dialogue written, and you're just inserting in your story beats for your starting and ending events and any recruitment conversations or talk conversations that you're going to include. Add those in, and then test. And when I test, I will usually go until I see some type of error, and then I'll restart. There's a typo, let me note that and go fix it real quick, come back to it, start again. And I'll go through this process of catching these errors and making these minor improvements. Oh, I should move this enemy back one space. This enemy needs to be adjusted. There's too many enemies in this one place. Let me push those reinforcements back a turn. And I'll do this over and over again for an hour or two, maybe longer depending on the nature of the chapter, until I'm satisfied and I'm like, okay, this is beatable, it's fun, let's move on to the next one. And then I repeat this process in manageable chunks. And that goes back to my minimum viable product. What do I need to push out a demo? I generally recommend that for a public-facing demo, you probably want to have at least 5 chapters at minimum so people can get a good feel for your game before you share with others. I think if you're like me, you probably want to get feedback a little bit more frequently, so having a smaller group of people who are on the back end playtesting with you can be really helpful. And if you're going to get any outside help, playtesting is the help to get. And so I know T-Dawes likes to talk about this idea of shack culture, or this idea that you have more frequent feedback sessions in kind of a back room setting where every chapter you make, you get feedback on it as you go. And that's fine too. I think that's great to get more feedback. Again, you just want to make sure that you're putting it out in manageable chunks. I think for a public-facing release and organizing your thread, you probably want to have more organized updates, right? So maybe I will put out 5 chapters. I'll get feedback. People will pour in with their feedback, I'm sure, saying this is what they liked, this is what they didn't like, this is what you change. I'll go through and I'll iterate and make those changes as I see necessary, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Push out a new update, and then once I feel pretty satisfied that I've gotten enough feedback, at that point I start moving on to my next 5 chapters or so, and repeat this process for those next 5. And the reason you want to do it in these manageable chunks is you don't want to go too long without getting any feedback, because you might realize your game is unbeatable, your game is not fun, and it's going to be a lot more work to go back and redo it than if you did it in these more manageable chunks. So getting that feedback early and often, really key. So how do you get feedback? Open beta. You got to do the open beta. I think it's misguided to try and make a whole project and then just release 30 chapters onto the world all at once without ever getting anyone else's eyes on it. I think you're just going to find that we as creators have blind spots, and we're not going to create something that is perfect on our own. We might think it's good and it might be a good starting point, but you need that outside feedback. Especially when I see project creators say well, you're supposed to do it this way. And it's well, if there's only one solution and it's not very obvious, that's not really a great player experience, because not everyone thinks the same way as you, person who made the thing. So you have to get that feedback. Open beta, really good. Again, those minimum viable patches of 5 to 7 chapters each is a really good kind of chunking mechanism for pushing out public releases. And as you're getting feedback from people, ask follow-up questions. One thing I really detest is when people are this is bad, or I don't like this. Don't be afraid to ask follow-up questions. And there's a difference between asking follow-up questions and getting defensive. When you're getting feedback, you really need to be open to it, because you have to. I always look at it from the angle of, wow, someone bothered to play this thing that I made. I should listen to what they have to say. At least give them that if they're willing to talk. And when I get feedback on something, I want to ask follow-up questions to understand a little bit more, especially when it's really surface level. Like, I didn't like Chapter 2. Well, it's like, well, what didn't you like about Chapter 2? Well, I felt like I didn't have enough units. Could you share a little bit more on what that means? Well, I felt like the way that the split was organized, my team was strapped for resources, and I had to play really slowly and carefully to advance because of how tough the enemies were. And if I had more units, perhaps I would be able to move faster as the game seems to want me to. That's actionable. That's actionable feedback that I could then take and go insert into the attack and fix it. If someone's just like, this isn't good. It's like, well, what does that mean? Good is so subjective and vague. So asking follow-up questions for clarity is really helpful. You want to break things down to being really specific. And that comes back to like this last point of actioning and ignoring. Because you're going to get feedback, and some of it's going to be really actionable, and others times it's not going to be. So asking follow-up questions is important to understand what exactly the specific thing is they want you to change, but then also understanding too, like what they care about. Like if someone told me, Dan, mounted units, they're too weak. Like I couldn't like put this unit on a forest with a hand axe and deal with these things on enemy phase. I really just don't think this hack is good. Like that tells me it's like, okay, like, well, that wasn't my intent. I don't want the player to be able to do that. So working as intended, right? That's very different from someone saying like, hey, this thing that you intended to do isn't working as you intended. So keep that in mind. Like not all feedback is created equal. Listen to people, give them respect, be cordial, but don't be afraid to say, actually, that wasn't my intent. My design goal is X, Y, or Z, but I appreciate your feedback all the same. Like that's all you need to do. Like, even yesterday I was having a discussion where someone was saying, like, they don't like the amount of horse slaying weapons on enemies because you need to check the enemies. And I'm like, well, that's kind of the point, is so that you are checking the enemies and taking them seriously. I can understand if people don't like this, if they want, like, a simpler experience, like, then turn down the difficulty. Or just, be willing to roll the dice a little bit more. Like, I don't know what else to tell you there. So, something to keep in mind. And remember, if multiple people are saying the same thing, it's probably a problem. So keep that in mind as well. If you get pretty consistent feedback that like, hey, this chapter is really unfair, it's probably unfair. If one person says it, take note of it, but if 5 people say it, then it's probably you, and you need to fix it. And if you have to like spend your time defending your actions too much, then dude, just change it. But again, there's a difference between compromising on your like artistic vision and making the chapter playable and fun. And so keep those things in mind and don't lose sight of it. And once you've gotten this feedback again, go back, keep working on it. It's an iterative process. One thing that you need to make sure you keep in mind, guys, and kind of just to summarize here with our friends Gilliam and Mulder, is that as you're developing, a finished project isn't made in a day. It's going to take time, and I believe you can do it. And I think that if you work in this type of method where you're releasing chapters in manageable chunks and getting that feedback, it's going to break up the process enough that it's going to be more enjoyable for you because you're doing a diversity of things versus like just one task over and over again for 30 chapters. But you're also going to get more feedback, you're going to get more support, and it's going to make your life a lot easier. I know that like I worked on my first demo of 12 chapters by myself, and then I released it and I got a ton of feedback and it was great. And then people actually wanted to help me make the project. And that made things a lot easier, and I was able to get more feedback and more ideas, and it really helped the project along and look very different than it was in its first iteration. And remember too, like, don't get discouraged. You might release your first like 5-chapter demo and someone might say like, this actually is really rough. You got to be ready for that. And just remember that none of the projects that you remember, or like any of the great completed ROM hack projects, started out as being fantastic in the first go. It's very rare. It takes time, it takes feedback. Don't be afraid to iterate, guys. And that's all I gotta say. I hope this is helpful for you. Remember, get feedback early and often, and don't release 30 chapters all at once. Keep a steady schedule. This music's getting a little loud for me, but don't put yourself in a situation where you feel pressured. Don't give yourself arbitrary deadlines. work at a pace that works for you, stay steady, and have fun. I hope this video was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to talk more about process. This was very off the cuff, as it always is. But until then, guys, be safe and take care.